The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Grade 78. Chapter 31. Grimace, Gold, GERD, Grift. Still November, 1996. That Saturday morning, Linda and Richard set out for Cornwall. Richard was acting a bit of a grouch. Well, really, a grimace, she thought, hiding her grin in her hand as she took in her husband in his royal purple jumper. It had been a Christmas present from the Cavendishes last year, and this was the first he was wearing it. "Are they expecting us for lunch?" he asked, adjusting the mirrors and checking his pocket atlas. The jumper was scratchy, and he was already considering ripping it off and dropping it in a skip or an Oxfam collection station. "I believe so. Mother said that Cook was making her famous meatloaf," Linda said with faint distaste, as Cook's famous meatloaf usually tasted as though it came from the nearly expired, freezer-burnt meat section of Sainsbury's. Cook had been Octavia's family cook when she'd grown up, and had to be approaching 100 years old by now. Well, with any luck, we'll hit a traffic jam on the M25 and we won't make it in time," Richard muttered to himself. "What did you say?" Linda asked, a bit waspishly. Richard spoke a bit louder. "I said, with any luck, we won't run into a traffic jam on the M25. Linda grinned. "That's what I thought you said. Well, if we do, we can always stop for lunch on the way. I've been craving a quarter-pounder with cheese lately for some reason." I've had enough Mackies lately. How do you feel about a Whopper, my burger queen?" Linda smiled. "Well, I do have a couple of very nice crowns, you know." "Do you, Lady Linda?" Richard asked in mock surprise. "You know I do, Richard. You did the dental work yourself." They laughed and settled in for the long drive ahead. In the end, the M25 didn't let Richard down. He was so glad for the momentary reprieve from his in-laws that he even agreed to eat lunch at McDonald's. Besides, the McRib was back. On Tuesday, Linda was surprised and pleased when Dora Tonks called her, asking if she would like to go out with her for a bite to eat. "That sounds lovely," she said. "I'll just let Richard know I'm having dinner with a friend." Strangely enough, he didn't ask who she was meeting for dinner. "Have a good time, Lindy Hop." "Are you sure you don't mind? I'm happy to make you something before I go. Or, perhaps I should just skip it. I know we didn't have plans, but I was looking forward to a nice night together, just the two of us. I know this past weekend is rough for you. Mum really was bang out of order, asking when you plan to start dyeing your hair." Richard smiled, touching his temples, which did indeed have a few silver strands starting to show. "I'm not sure what she was thinking. Doesn't she know heroes never die?" "Just don't colour it, all right? I'm looking forward to your silver fox years," Linda chuckled. "You're sure you don't mind me going out for a bite?" "Not at all. Have a great time, love." As soon as Richard heard the station wagon backing out of the drive, he allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. He had been fretting over how he could explain his sudden departure to Linda this evening. They had returned from Cornwall very late on Sunday, and after a grueling Monday at work, had fallen into bed at barely 7:30. This was their first night alone together in several days, and he had worried that she would be miffed if he left suddenly. He withdrew his mobile from his pocket and thumbed through his contacts down to Lobo. "Ready," said his text message. Merely seconds after hitting send, there was a cracking noise in the entryway. Lobo came round the corner into the living room, looking rather haggard and drawn, but bright-eyed. "Did Linda go out, then?" "Yes, a friend of hers called her up for dinner tonight. Lucky it happened," Richard said, gathering the large bag of medical supplies he had collected, ready for tonight. "Yes, very lucky," Lobo agreed. From his pocket, He produced a green drawstring pouch. He used his wand to light a fire in the fireplace. Within seconds it was crackling merrily. "Right then, let's go." Richard came to stand by him, and the man tossed a pinch of green powder from the drawstring pouch into the fire. "Hogwarts headmaster's office." To Richard Granger's delight and amazement, the debridement went exactly as hoped. He had sanitized and prepared the room, which was a private space, off of the school infirmary. Professor Snape was able to enchant the darkness in Dumbledore's body down to one index finger whilst they watched. As soon as the black skin reached the topmost knuckle, Lobo swooped in to perform a stasis charm. The infirmary matron Madame Pomfrey assisted with the severing charm, and with adept agility, Richard performed the debridement procedure quickly. Lobo maintained the stasis charm whilst Snape siphoned off the blood with his wand and chanted healing charms. They waited a few minutes before Lobo removed his stasis charm. Miraculously, almost inexplicably, it had worked. There was no new growth of blackness, and Madame Pomfrey's diagnostic charm revealed no dark magic within the old wizard. "I should like Madame Pomfrey to keep you here for observation tonight, just to be sure. But I believe it is done," Snape said, unable to keep the awe out of his voice. Professor Dumbledore's eyes were misty as he took in the three before him. "I cannot tell you enough how much I appreciate everything you've done here tonight. Thank you, each and every one of you, for working together to save my life." He smiled, raising an eyebrow over his half-moon spectacles at Richard. "I suppose I shall have to die another day." Lobo cleared his throat nervously, fighting away his own tears as he beamed at his friend. "Will you use a false finger, Professor Dumbledore?" he asked. "Mouse says that Peter Pettigrew has a silver hand that he uses now for some reason." "Yes, but I think I should like it to be gold. Gold is much less susceptible to corrosion, and is more compatible with our bodies." He turned to Richard. "What do you think, Mr. Granger? Shall I have a gold finger?" Richard laughed a bit giddily, as much in relief that everything had gone well, as in amusement at Dumbledore's turns of phrase. New Year's Eve, 1996. It was early in the afternoon when Bellatrix began getting ready for the evening's festivities. She took her time and a lot of special care to make herself even more beautiful than usual tonight. She used an ungodly amount of sleek-easy on her hair, and had chosen foundational undergarments that pushed her tits up to the point of near impossibility, and had chosen a deep green gown that showed off a fair bit of leg. She wanted everything to be perfect. She was determined that the Dark Lord would see her looking gorgeous tonight, and with any luck put a spawn in her as well. Unfortunately, she was having a hard time marshalling her thoughts away from the interloper. It had been a curious few months, having him around. According to the Dark Lord, he had been raised as a Muggle. It was possible that any magic he possessed had been snuffed out by his upbringing. That day at the Ministry, he hadn't used a traditional wand, and since that day, as far as Bellatrix was aware, the interloper had not been sent out on any missions. Instead, he seemed to come to meetings simply to offer strange, but oddly often helpful advice to the Dark Lord. For example, when Voldemort appeared to be experiencing pain in his torso one day, the man had produced from his Muggle jacket an unusually shaped bottle filled with colourful discs that looked like sweets. Writing on the bottle said "Rinny" in large letters. He had offered the Dark Lord some, explaining that they might help him feel better. Voldemort made Wormtail eat some first. When the man didn't die after a few minutes, and his diagnostic spell seemed healthy, Voldemort took some as well, and felt better within moments. "May I have these?" the Dark Lord had asked, tilting the bottle gently to and fro in fascination, watching as the little discs clattered in the plastic bottle. "Of course. I can get more. Indigestion is the worst," the interloper told him. Bellatrix had stewed in the corner of the room. And then there was this whole Muggle sales business. What the fuck was that even about? Bellatrix was still confused. Richard and Linda flew into Malfoy Manor, dressed in their finest black tie formal wear. It was one of their first nights out in quite some time. Work had been rather busy, and their own individual activities had taken up more than a few evenings each week. However, the night of the Malfoy New Year's Eve Gala put all of their separate adventures out of mind of Richard and Linda. It had been several long weeks since the two of them had gone out together in the evening, and months since they had dressed up and gone somewhere nice. Both of them were determined to have a good time, in spite of the dangers that each of them knew lurked in Malfoy Manor. Lord Voldemort stepped forward almost immediately after they emerged from the fireplace. He nodded first to Richard, then bowed toward Linda.
"Hello, Richard. Mrs. Granger, I do not believe I had the pleasure of talking with you the last time we were all together,"
the Dark Lord said smoothly as he greeted Linda in the Malfoy drawing-room. So far this evening, Bellatrix's efforts to beautify herself had had little effect on Voldemort, who had barely spared her a glance as she entered the drawing-room. He only had eyes for his disgusting child's disgusting Muggle mother. Bellatrix tossed back her spiced rum and glared at the Muggle woman, who had the audacity to arrive in a midnight blue dress that barely skimmed her shape. "Hiya, Bellatrix!" She spun around. "Oh, it's you," she sneered. The interloper had somehow crept up on her when she'd been distracted by his Muggle wife. "What do you want?" "Ah, geez, just saying howdy to you. Offering my best for the new year." Howdy? Was that some kind of spell she was unfamiliar with? She was still entirely unsure if this man could perform magic. It was true, he seemed to be able to captivate Lord Voldemort with his increasingly outlandish and off-the-wall ideas. Was that his magic? Now the interloper stood across from her, staring intently at her. "Bellatrix, are you all right?" Bellatrix's eyes refocused, and she realized that she had been lost in thought, and had not paid attention as the interloper had spoken to her. "What did you say?" she snapped. "I was just saying how lovely you look tonight. Green is such a striking color on you." She was momentarily at a loss for how to respond. It had been so long since someone had given her a compliment. Thank you." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth. There was a lull in their conversation, and nearby both of them overheard Lucius speaking loudly to McNair over the orchestral music. "Ah, yes, I agree, this music is quite nice. It's far better than what we have been listening to around here. All hours of the day and night, just an absolute cacophony of noise. I never thought that a harp being played could sound so much like a herd of cats dying. And please, don't get me started on the cymbals." The interloper turned back to Bellatrix. "Ah, so it sounds like they're banding together. I trust he was able to get the instruments to them, then. A regular, they might be giants in the making, yes?" "They are giants," Bellatrix said snidely. Then her eyes widened in surprise. "Was that you? Did you give Lucius those instruments to leave for the giants?" "Ah, geez, I did. Is that all right? I thought it might give them something to do besides pull up trees and throw rocks at each other." Bellatrix grinned wickedly. "It has been driving my brother-in-law mad for weeks. He says that he barely sleeps, even with a silencing charm in his suite. Every time I come to visit,
It sounds as though they are torturing each other slowly with noise. He's talked of packing them up and apparating them far away just to be rid of them, perhaps to some remote forest in Istanbul."
"Not Constantinople?" The interloper frowned.
"It's now called Istanbul," she said.
"Not Constantinople?"
Bellatrix gritted her teeth. "No."
"Ah, geez. Well, I didn't mean to make poor Lucius suffer that way." Then he looked down at Bellatrix, matching her wicked grin. "But I suppose it's a necessary evil. They're no good to us if they kill each other first. Better if they are all on the same sheet of music."
Bellatrix's grin grew wider. Perhaps this Richard fellow wasn't so bad.
"What an interesting night," Linda said, as they stepped back into their own living room. She kicked off the silver pumps that had been killing her feet for several hours, glad to be home. "Yes, very interesting. I'm glad to be out of there, though. Some of those people are rather insufferable."
Richard loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top button of his tuxedo.
"It looked as though Bellatrix was being polite this time, at least to you. This summer I put my foot in my mouth and made a rather rude comment to her. I think she has hated me ever since," Linda said, walking into the kitchen for a glass of water before bed. "Yes, she is an odd one. I don't think she makes friends very easily. She seems a bit mentally unstable."
Richard followed her into the kitchen, leaning against the counter.
"So, what did you and Voldemort talk about?"
"Not much," Linda said lightly. "Narcissa warned me that I shouldn't share information with him, considering who he is." The topic of Voldemort had come up between them exactly one time since the reception at Malfoy Manor back in the summer. It happened a couple of days after Linda had learned from Narcissa exactly who the man was who'd been talking to Draco and Hermione at the party. Linda had asked Richard if he had known who he was, and he told her that he had been introduced to him, conveniently leaving out the fact that the introduction had been made several months before. They had agreed that the Dark Lord being back was bad news, but that this should be treated as a case of keeping your friends close and your enemies closer. Better to maintain a semblance of friendship with the Malfoys for protection, not only for themselves, but for Hermione. In truth, neither of them wanted the other to know their part in any of it, and so neither of them was eager to discuss it with the other. Still, Linda found it hard to let it go tonight.
"Does Lucius ever talk about him?" "Not really," hedged Richard.
The man asked about Hermione, you know. He seemed surprised that I knew she wasn't my biological daughter for some strange reason. But I didn't want to discuss the fact that she was adopted. That wizard gives me the creeps."
"You're not the only one," agreed Richard.
"And what was all that business about his company? I felt like I was at a sales pitch for Oriflame. Is he really starting a company? It sounded almost like a pyramid scheme."
"No idea,"
Richard said nonchalantly. In truth, Richard had a very good idea, because it had been his idea in the first place. Flashback. October 1996. When Richard had first suggested the idea of a pyramid scheme to Voldemort back in October, it was on a bit of a lark. He'd had a patient that day who was involved in Amway, and was trying to pressure his staff into buying in and joining his downline. Richard had grown up in an Avon household, with a mother who was often stressed about meeting her sales goals, so he knew the struggle that the patient was facing, but the man that day had seemed unwilling to take no for an answer, and Richard had had to be quite firm with him. The Order had been trying to come up with ways to sidetrack Voldemort, to pull his attention away from his far more sinister plan of killing Muggles and Muggle-borns and taking over the world, beginning with Britain.
They felt that if Richard could present another task for the Dark Lord to focus on, it might divide his strength. So when the idea of a pyramid scheme occurred to him, it seemed the perfect distraction. It had all occurred one night a few months before, a dreary October evening. The Death Eaters were sitting round a large, seldom-used dining room in Malfoy Manor that the Dark Lord had taken over as his own. Everyone was listening intently to Voldemort as he discussed the ways that he planned to take over the Muggle world once he had achieved domination over the Wizarding one.
"We must kill all those who rise up against us. We seek power over the oppressors. We must do all we can to crush the Muggle systems of government, education, and free enterprise."
Richard took a deep, calming breath, and unclenched his teeth. "Well, if you're planning to achieve world domination, I think relying on the strengths of the Wizarding world is the best way to do it." There was silence in the room, as everyone waited to see if Richard would be punished for interrupting. Finally, Voldemort simply said,
"Explain what you mean, cousin."
"Well, Muggles are known for believing in, let's say, alternative therapies, the mystical, nonconformist remedies, snake oils and the like." Nagini raised her head hopefully.
"Yes,"
Voldemort sneered from his seat at the head of the table.
"Quite idiotic, the lot of them."
Richard nodded sagely. "Quite. So, the best way to get them on your side is to get them to feel as though they could access the benefits of wizardry and witchcraft without actually providing them with real witchery. Create a product that bills itself as a magical cure-all for everything that ails them, and they will flock to you. You won't have to hunt them. They will even pay you for it."
"And how do I go about doing this?"
"Well, first things first, you've got to incorporate, form a private limited company, and register it with Revenues and Customs. You'll have to choose a catchy name, something that conveys ability and strength, something that the Muggles will trust." Voldemort looked thoughtful.
"I have heard an excellent Scottish name that I believe I may adopt as my own. We shall call it MacDonald's."
Unfortunately, I believe that name is already taken," Richard said gently.
"But I should like to use it as my own."
"Yes, the difficulty is there are some within the Muggle population who may already be familiar with the name from something different. I believe it will be too difficult to use the name McDonald's for your company. However, for your own private use, I think it is perfection." Voldemort gave a disgruntled nod, as though mollified.
"Very well. Does anyone have a suggestion?"
There was silence in the room. Luckily, Richard Granger's brain was made for coming up with things to fill such silence. Well, I did have the idea of the Fixer Elixir. It's catchy, gets right to the point of what you're trying to sell. It would be fairly easy to create a jingle and branding for the merchandise side of the house. And as for the product itself, it's simple sugar and caffeine placebo. It'll give the user the temporary endorphin fix they're looking for." Voldemort nodded, as though he understood everything Richard had just said. Across the room, Bellatrix rolled her eyes so hard that Richard was a bit surprised they didn't fall out. Voldemort frowned.
"But when the product is used and does not work properly long-term, they will no longer buy it."
"Nope. That's when we really go for it. That's the time to upsell them to the new and improved magical fixer elixir. Tell them it has more nutrients for detoxifying and healing."
Voldemort nodded slowly. "Yes. Yes. And the second elixir can be a poison. We can eradicate millions of Muggles quite easily."
Richard's stomach twisted into a knot. Well, you have to walk a fine line with that."
"What do you mean?"
"I only mean, if you eliminate all the Muggles, for one, you have no more profit. And then you have to consider that without Muggles, you have no one to act as your servants. Who's going to prepare food, work in factories, repair things? Elves can only do so much. You have to keep some of the Muggles around, you know."
Voldemort seemed to consider this. "Perhaps you are right. Well, then, once we have sold the elixir, what then?"
"Well, you see, that's the beauty of it. The product isn't really the elixir. It's the follow-on customers. The way it works is you start with a couple of salespeople, and they sell to their friends, but they also get their friends to sell to their friends, and then those people sell to their friends, and so on and so forth, until you have only a handful of people at the top, and many salespeople at the bottom. The people who come into the business later end up paying more because they are paying all the people in front of them."
Bellatrix's agitation was clear from across the room. Apparently she could hold her tongue no longer.
"My lord!"
"Yes, Bellatrix?"
"This sounds foolish. Allow me to go out into the Muggle world. I can kill 30 or 40 of them a day, easily."
"But this elixir, I think it could reach many more. We only need to gain their trust, and then we introduce the poison. It could be thousands at once," Voldemort said excitedly.
And that was how Richard Granger came to be in charge of the product known as the Fixer Elixir. His idea for the plan had been simple. He would come to Voldemort for opinions on everything: logo, product design, taste and smell. He felt certain that the research development chaps at MI6 would enjoy taking on the challenge. He would invent lengthy lists of fictional customers and exhaustive fake market research. He would create a fake bookkeeping spreadsheet and fake brochures, falsified bank statements. Voldemort would believe they were reaching thousands, when in fact they were doing nothing of the sort. What he did not count on was Quentin Jugson, a Death Eater who had apparently been waiting for just such a moment to display his uncanny marketing prowess. "My lord, if I may assist Lord Granger in this endeavour—"
"You may, Jugson."
Richard Granger took one look at the eager face of Jugson, who looked as though all his dreams had come true at once. Oh, this wasn't good. "Ah, jeez," he said, a bit miserably.
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.